Turning Turn podcast. My guest today is returning Matthew Ehret. He is an author, researcher, a filmmaker. He has an incredible film coming out very soon, although it might actually have aired by the time we air this. We're going to probably talk a little bit about that. We'll see where it goes today. We had a bunch of topics on the roster, so we will see where that leads. Matt, how are you doing today?
Hey, Courtney, I'm doing great. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Likewise. Yeah. Thanks for being here. So there's no shortage of things going on. I know we had talked about the Pope, and the last Pope was a Jesuit, which they're not supposed to be popes, right? That's my understanding, but he was. And that was one of the topics we had thrown around, was this Jesuit takeover of the Vatican. And then you also had sent me this article, which I had not read before. It's titled "The Darwinian Perversion of Christianity," and this really resonated. I'm actually in the process of writing a Substack on, if I get the chance to finish anything, but I'm talking about the Christian veneer that they're using, and the three that I had brought up were, I'm seeing it in ARC, which is, Jordan Peterson's Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, Game B, which was not at all a Christian movement, but Jordan Hall, who is one of the founders of Game B, recently converted last year. And a lot of what he's talking about, he has a video where he's at Prospera. So this is Peter Thiel's Prospera, and it's the Startup Societies Foundation where he's speaking. He's doing a presentation. Apparently, he did one 4 years ago that was called Game B. Was it Game B Network States? I think that's what it was called. That was 4 years ago. And then he recently, this year, did this one. It was a very short one, but it was on Network States. Anyway, the cliff notes of it is that at the end of it, he talks about liturgy and how we should use liturgy we need to incorporate this concept into the network state. And he's essentially talking about using liturgy for communitarianism. And yeah, I'm pretty sure that that's not what liturgy is about. But he also was in a video recently, a podcast. He's doing the circuit because he was part of this Limicon conference. But he talked about how, somebody had asked him on this podcast about how Ephesians 4 in the Bible teaches you collective cognition. And so they had a whole discussion. Yes, I know, the look on your face is priceless. That was kind of my response. Yeah. So we have now and then there's a whole podcast which actually was titled Game B Christianity. So they're bringing this up, but it was just, to me, before I gave the benefit of the doubt initially, but before I even knew what was, much about his conversion, it just really kind of it felt very reminiscent of the Russell Brands and the Candaceoans and, a lot of these figures who are converting. But when you hear him talk, it's very similar. He talks about Christ consciousness, which is really not very Christian, at least not in the Bible. So we have that one, and then the Dark Enlightenment, because Peter Thiel keeps saying he's a Christian. I'm not sure how it's commensurate with biblical Christianity, but somehow accelerationism and transhumanism are Christian in his worldview. But yeah, he has a bunch of shows and written material where he talks about how he ties Christianity to this Dark Enlightenment kind of concepts and, justifies it through Christianity. So anyway, when I was reading your article on Chardin rewriting Christianity, essentially, it also reminded me of his intellectual disciple, Barbara Marx Hubbard, who took it upon herself to rewrite the New Testament. Right. She told her dear friend Buckminster Fuller, that she had this vision that the New Testament had to be rewritten. And so she took it upon herself because, of course, who was going to do it but her? And she's clearly the visionary who would have such an insight. And Bucky told her that he had the same vision. He was so proud of her. So I guess Teilhard de Chardin's visions had been executed through Barbara Marx Hubbard. So, yeah. So, yeah. So, but yeah. That's all. that was a lot, but
no, but it's definitely Yeah, it's the same theme, right? Like this point of corruption is always the deification of the ego. I think that that's part of like the way the devil kind of like gets in and gets in control is by creating movements, ideological, spiritual movements that amplify the ego, which is normally something you want to like you don't want to get rid of the ego, like the ego, the sense of like I, self-consciousness. Like you don't want to get rid of that, but you want to mature it and harmonize it with a contextual reality, which is beyond yourself as you mature from, the terrible twos of thinking the universe revolves around you. And, if you stay like that throughout your years, it used to be seen as pathetic and like sad.
Yeah.
But and because a healthy society should encourage people to realize that no, you're gonna die. It's part of the fact of life is our mortality, and
Right.
so based on that fact that we should be not afraid of, we should think it through. The point then of an identity that we choose to develop should be based upon like how do we situate our role and our purpose in a broader continuum that will resonate long after we're dead, and the good works that we do and the thoughts that we leave are going to resonate, and we want to be amplifiers for God's creation and will and reason and love. And so to be the best possible amplifier we could be should be sort of the goal as our egos, harmonize with that. And these guys, they just avoid that entire process completely and go straight to the deification of their ego and start seeing themselves as the creators of truth, in a very selfish little way, and associated with political power. This is so destructive. It's done so much evil to humanity. And yet, Barbara Marx Hubbard, all these Lucius Trust people that you've exposed so many times over, and Buckminster Fuller and Tayel de Chaldane is no exception. You read their writings, and it's thick. It's thick with this like new agey, light in life, virtue signaling fake philosophy that is very attractive on some level to many people, but it's all rooted in this deep, deep arrogance that they're somehow uh they have been that they're a member, that they're members of some high enlightened aristocracy
Yes.
that's just better than most everyone else, and that they can thus, because of their experience of gnosis,
Yes.
play the role of gods shaping the game board of humanity. And and yeah, I was surprised to see that Sheldon was so explicit, which is why I quote from him so much in my essay.
This
um
this one right here. I mean, you had a whole bunch that were, very explicit, but in your essay, in a letter dated March 21st, 1941, he wrote, "I cannot fight against Christianity. I can only work inside it by trying to transform and convert it. A revolutionary attitude would be much easier and much more pleasant, but it would be suicidal. So I must go step by step tenaciously." So he's like literally admitting that he's infiltrating from within to subvert.
yeah, exactly. It's very clear, like he wants to recast Christianity in something he thinks is more befitting of the ideology that he's committed to, as somebody who lives his life to devoted to fusing Darwinian principles into Christianity, which is completely like oil and water. Like it's these are
Yeah.
incompatible. There's incompatible ideas of man, of the creator of the universe's law in both of those systems. And he devotes his life from a very young age to fusing those things together to try to impose Darwinian logic or deify. He wants to deify Darwinian logic, which is highly mechanistic. It's highly rooted in a randomness, a principle of assumed randomness of the mutations that are just rolling of the dice occurring at all times, that sometimes give rise to a bigger claw or whatever, that gives a predator the ability to kill more of the weaker, that we're not as lucky on the dice rolling as he was or she was,
Right.
and they can procreate more. And that's one of the core elements of Darwin. The rejection of any type of directionality is also a core element of Darwinianism, which is I mean, teleology is super important within Christian and I would say every Abrahamic faith's religion when it's at least the well-grounded versions of all of these faiths. What makes them viable is that there's a moral teleology, that there's a purpose beyond the momentary fluxes that we could choose to look at in a process that's tied to something, again, moral, that is unfolding. And so there's so many points of these incongruences between Darwin's sort of the Royal Society controllers like Thomas Huxley, the handler of Darwin, and the school of authentic Christianity. So to try to merge them together and even commit frauds the way he did, playing a directing role in things like the Piltdown Man hoax, the Peking Man later on, decades later, like these provable hoaxes where they, that he played a directing role. He was the guy who found these random like shards of bone and teeth that was so-called discovered to be the missing link that somehow proved Darwin's theory, which didn't have missing links in the evidence, right? So that's Darwin presumes that everything is gradualism, everything is slowly adapting. But the problem was the fossil records and the evidence of nature shows that we don't have gradualism. We have these discontinuous leaps, which was a big problem for Darwinism and still is today.
Mm-hmm.
But so Chaldea was like, oh, I found it. I found the thing between monkey and human. And it was like while he was on vacation in England, and it was just, he happened to be the guy who just stumbled on. And then they proved, years later that it was just like a spray painted dog bone merged onto, or dog jaw merged onto a monkey head or something that fooled a lot of experts for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And then when that, so this guy's like a liar. He's playing the role of a stage magician for something very bad, and yet he's treated like he's some enlightened hero of the new age. It's nuts.
It is truly nuts. And I'm not fully like, I don't know the whole history but it does seem like he had lots of handlers. That's my guess, that he wasn't just a grandiose hubristic character. I'm sure he was that as well, but I would imagine they used that in order to have.
Well, he seemed to come from, he definitely had some handlers. Like, in my article, I bring up one of the key groomers of him as a young boy was George Tyrrell, who was a Jesuit modernist. These modernists of the 1880s, 1890s and he's French, but they were like obsessed with making the church relevant. So reforming the ethos of the church
Mm-hmm.
in order to make it adaptive to the times that it found itself in.
Mm-hmm.
And there was like, an element, there's always like these guys are successful because there's always like an element of truth in what they do, but then they misuse it because it's like there was a problem in many quarters with those who overvalued tradition
Mm-hmm.
and denied certain obvious scientific and technological improvements. That's been a problem in every religious grouping in the world,
Right.
a tendency to rigidity and these things. But does that mean you need to completely overhaul the entire thing, like the entire religious structure? Well, these guys certainly thought that was what needed to be done. So that the idea was, well, just like their philosophy was, being Jesuits, being highly chameleon-like and malleable. They're good at infiltrating and to everything to every man is one of the mottos of the Jesuits, right? That's Pope Francis, former Archbishop Bergoglio of Argentina. But so part of with his 32 race Jesuit son, really creepy character. Anyway, what they were doing, like part of their logic was, well, just like our cultural traditions, aesthetical, architectural, scientific traditions are malleable and flow with the times, so too must the religious values flow and be adaptive with the times. So these modernists that were already there, that saw a young Pierre de Chaldin and saw talent in him, they groomed him, and he became soon a leader amongst the modernists. And I think part of it might be a family connection because he's from the family of Voltaire. That's also useful to keep in mind. Voltaire being a key figure behind the
Interesting.
most perverse expressions of the Enlightenment,
Yeah.
um, and himself part of a high bloodline, Jesuit trained, I think is probably not a coincidence.
Right.
Um, Probably you'd find some, I would imagine, as we often do when you do digging on these things, some Rosicrucian, Invisible College connections, which is almost always something you walk into. I didn't find it with Voltaire yet, but I did. Voltaire was the big popularizer of Sir Isaac Newton and
Right.
the enemy of Leibniz, who wrote his Candide in 1740 something, 1742, to try to attack the dynamic thinking of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the guy who actually discovered the infinitesimal calculus and was a leading statesman, grand strategist, kind of like a Benjamin Franklin type, scientist, statesman, artist type, who was an enemy of Newton and the Rosicrucians. So the fact that Voltaire would both provide the most biting, visceral, disgusting attack on Leibniz's legacy, and at the same time be the big promoter of Isaac Newton, the Rosicrucian alchemist,
Mhm.
is probably not a coincidence. And so, yeah, the fact that just a few generations later you'd have Chaldea coming out of that, I think great 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 grandnephew or something, probably also not a coincidence. Yeah, but definitely handlers, definitely family connections for sure.
Yeah. Well, this beyond good and evil concept is definitely straight out of like really all of the ancient mystery schools, right? Definitely the Kabbalistic kind of concept of the primeval evil. Obviously Nietzschean will to power, right? You transcend. He wrote his whole book on beyond good and evil. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, so I thought that concept was really interesting too. I didn't actually know that about Chardin.
Well, you can pull up that quote again. That quote on Beyond Good and Evil. That's worth reading. We could read that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's very explicit. You want to read that?
In our modern perspective of a universe in a process of cosmogenesis, the problem of evil no longer exists. Events are essentially subject to the play of probabilities of chance in its arrangements. It's absolutely unable to progress towards unity without engendering evil here or there by statistical necessity. And then you put
Yeah.
the very act of bloodshed, war, and evil on the earth were merely necessarily events on the path of life governed by that beautiful future omega point, whereby humanity would evolve into a transhuman species of loving cyborg. Former Jesuit historian Malachi Martin wrote that Teilhard was not overly shocked bloodshed uh, not overly shocked by bloodshed, regarded violence as a necessary concomitant of evolution, and seemed to have enjoyed war. What he saw of it, death, bloody or otherwise, was what he called a mutation.
Yeah, this guy, he had a very disgusting philosophy, but yeah, he clearly liked Nietzsche, who he also liked. And again, just like
Mm-hmm.
a Christian trying to say, I adore Darwin, it's absurd because Darwin's philosophy is not just incompatible, it's antagonistic to
Yeah.
Christian core axioms. But same thing for Nietzsche, who completely despises Christianity and the idea of judging good and evil. Nietzsche, it drives him nuts. He devoted his life to annihilating any ability to judge right and wrong. So the fact that Chaldin is emulating both of those guys is weird, but he's very explicit that he substitutes in his, because he has a teleology. He has unlike Darwin, he has a directionality in his model of the universe and the unfolding of life. However, um, what he does, because that's what you see in Christian theologians, they believe in that there's a directionality,
Right.
except that he substitutes right and wrong, good and evil as factors shaping the unfolding of that directionality for simple complexity,
Mm-hmm.
quantitative complexity. And that's where we're moving into greater degrees of quantitative potential.
Mm-hmm.
And to the degree that there's more quantitative potential, whatever that even means, because it's super underdefined,
Right.
that is the right thing to do. the wrong thing to do is to reduce. But then what does that potential mean in his mind, right? Who is he devoted to? What's his worldview? Well, he's a eugenicist. He believes in racial superiority. He believes in the superiority of the higher breeds, which he probably thinks, being from a high family tied to Voltaire, he probably thinks himself to be one of these divine bloods.
Yep.
So your idea of potential becomes increasingly, like I was alluding to, a world of loving cyborgs. Like it's his idea is that we are going to merge with machines, which is why he's working with Julian Huxley, the president of the Eugenics Society. They're very close collaborators for many, many years.
Yep.
And together they co-formulate in the 1950s the notion of like the modern notion of transhumanism.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, Julian Huxley and Chaldea, who both co-promoted that at the same point before anyone else.
Mm-hmm. 7, his new bottle for red wine, right?
Or new wineskin, new wineskins for new wine or something.
I think it was, yeah, something like that. New bottles for red wine, I think. New bottle for new bottle.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. Julian Huxley.
Something like that. Yeah, that was the Julian Huxley
new
trap.
wine is what it was. Yeah. I have red wine, but yeah, new bottles for new wine. But it was 1957. Yeah.
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 So yeah, these guys are just are absolutely gross. And again, they masquerade their language, their cold, eugenic, anti-human language behind a loving set of terms. But when you look at the way that they're thinking, those terms of love and goodness that are so attractive, they don't really mean anything because they ultimately despise humanity. They think evil or the creation of mass murder, injustice are, like the author correctly noted, the Malachi Martin, himself a former a repented Jesuit who exposed a lot of this, though I think he might also be he might be a limited hangout. I don't know. But Malachi Martin made the point. He sees everything as just like a necessary mutation. The injustices, the brutality, the wars, all of the evil that we would identify as evil is not only necessary, it's kind of good because it's accelerating the tension needed for those mutations in the
spiral.
Is what yeah. To this imagined omega point.
Yes, this is exactly. I wrote about this in my book. This is you take the polar opposites, right, and they create the dialectical churn of the centrifugal force that helps them spiral up towards the omega point. That's exactly what it is. So
yeah,
you need that. You need both the good and the evil in order to achieve the transcendence, and that was
and it's such a lame backflip of mental gymnastics where the good becomes in practicality. Oh yeah, that's a wonderful, and I love the AI image that you constructed. It's fun. But that I've read through a lot of that.
What?
Huh? I've read through a big chunk of that. Okay. That's excellent.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the cover was definitely a very collaborative effort. It took a long time to get AI to even do any of it because the input was just not coming out at all. But then my lovely handy graphic artist who he was able to work some magic. So
massage it into behaving well. Yeah, no, I mean it's like, good becomes secondary, like less, not only does it become like secondary or less important to evil, like evil takes on the attribute in practice, though they may not say so explicitly. This is, or not in their exoteric outward sort of teachings, but in practice and probably in their esoteric inner teachings for the few, evil becomes more good than the good, and the good becomes actually a bad because the good is not only something that can't even exist without evil, which is primary in their construction of their Gnostic system. And, in the Gnostic view, the universe is ultimately made evil in the image of an evil creator. Thus, the goods that you see in the beauty that appears to your senses when you look at a flower, you see good deeds done from or motherly love, and all of these beautiful acts are actually just an illusion.
Yeah.
betraying the reality of the deep evil embedded in the fabric of physical space-time. And that's the reality that you have to just come to recognize and integrate with that darkness. And I guess that gets us sort of into, I think we're hovering around one of these themes that's been sort of promoted, and you alluded to it at the very beginning, right? Of the dark enlightenment
Yep.
notion that they're invoking, kind of like a magic trick, or the dark freedom motion that, or notion that certain intellectual Gnostics in Russia, whose names I will leave out right now, are also invoking at the same time with dark MAGA, dark enlightenment, dark freedom.
Yep.
They're trying to fuse these profane and holy ideas into some unnatural unity, which all Gnostics need to do. And they're trying to make it more mass, like palatable for the masses, which is also very sickening that that's something that they're trying to get everybody to sort of find and channel and tap into the darkness within themselves in a very Jungian sort of invocation, right? Jordan Peterson plays a big role in a lot of this stuff too.
Yeah. Face the monster within you. Become the monster. Isn't that what he says?
Something like that. Yeah, like channel it, make it work for you. And yeah, it's all of a sudden like you're identifying more and more with, and it's like, but why not like transform? Okay, if we have shadows, we have shit in our subconscious, okay, but like why can't we be like creatively potent
Mm-hmm.
without channeling this darkness? Why can't we like become more sublime, like transform and ennoble our being to become lovers of truth and goodness, and sort of domesticate that beast to become useful as part of that process, not as a beast that's evil or that's channeling dark feelings and passions that are like, like really demonic. Like just ennoble it as a human being probably should, I would say, as we work on our like the ego, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
ego with all of its subconscious influences and the irrational things we do and self-sabotage. Like why just treat the ego as if it's something that you have to um either integrate with darkness or like subdue by self deprivation or beating yourself like a flagellant, but instead just like ennoble it to love the good and to go out, to just be a better person every day and to learn how to find love for yourself and love for the other as you harmonize your identity in the short time we have in this life. Then they don't even go there. It's like that doesn't even exist as a thing for these people. They never bring it into their discourse because they don't like it. They're in opposition to that way of thinking, in fact. So
Well,
it's
I think they're ultimately anti-human, right? This is
yeah.
you're talking about the eugenics in this article and the Malthusian principles, and they are inherently anti-human. And really, when I think about the ego is there for survival. It's a protective mechanism. So it's not to be deified so that we can become our own gods and have this egoistic framework where we become these narcissistic, hubristic. Megalomaniacs. That's not the purpose of the ego. So it's not to be glorified, but it's not to be shamed either. It's not like the root of all evil. It is there literally for survival. It's there to protect us. So if we have a love for humanity and we want to see humanity flourish, not in the human 2.0 kind of way, but truly become the best versions of ourselves, then we would see the ego as it's there to protect us and recognize when it's serving us and when maybe it's not serving us so much, but it's coming from experiences or some, like, it's a combination of things, right? The nature, nurture, sometimes just the circumstances, but sometimes we have egoic responses, and it's from something that has been, it's a trigger, and it doesn't necessarily serve us anymore. So it's for us to use our reflective introspection to determine, okay, this is I'm having this reaction because I am in survival mode, and I need this. This is there to protect me, or okay, maybe this isn't serving me anymore. But it's
Right.
that's a love that's coming from the perspective of a love for humanity, love for self, love for others, not a deification or shaming kind of a
Yeah.
duality.
Right. Yeah, and that sort of like gets at so when you look at like the Christ consciousness, or he has this whole model of the universe being having been created by cosmogenesis, and you got the biogenesis later on that gave rise to life, and these different phases,
Yeah.
these phase spaces that have an element of truth, like that there's a divine spark animating creation, that there's a divine spark that also animates the appearance of life. And out of that, you've got, human consciousness that emerged. There are these emergent things that properties that do seem to exist.
Sure.
And then ultimately everything's moving towards his assumed state of that omega point wherein this Christ consciousness will emerge. But if you're an elitist and a eugenicist, and you're calling for the scientific purification of the species according to eugenical principles, which Thiertael de Chaldin is, and he's explicit about that, then what does your idea of that even mean? Does that mean everybody in your world is going to somehow actualize their Christ divine consciousness and become all perfect beings who are God? No, not at all. It just means that you and your initiated elite are going to be able to integrate the absolute good with the absolute evil that you think of as inside of you into some unity. And then you'll be better able to clearly lord over as high priests or, overlords, the vast majority who have to stay underpopulated and in the Shadowlands, so that they are not allowed to develop their potentialities because they have to remain slaves. So ultimately, that part is not explicit, but that's why it's so important, I think, to have you and I, we've talked a lot about Plato. What I think is so important about studying Plato's dialogues is that he teaches one to look for what is implicit when you can find the axioms, the core axioms of somebody's meta narrative or model of their. Everybody has hypothetical models that they have, whether they were put into their heads by teachers or experts or their family and friends that they just took on the opinions of, or that they even thought through a little bit on their own in a philosophy class. But we have core assumptions about the universe and about economics and about the purpose of life. But in all of Plato's dialogues, he's like, look, getting people to learn how to look for the core axioms, the seeds out of which the tree of further logic will emerge ideologically, right? The logic that the core idea will generate logical consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So even though that person hasn't thought through all of the logical consequences and the different branches that could be generated from that axiom that they have, if they have that axiom, it means that they also implicitly, though they may not even thought about it, have that implicit view of whatever,
Mm-hmm.
I believe human beings are bounded by the same principles of the monkey species. Okay, you believe that? You're a good person? Fine. Did you know that means you must also conclude that we need to have a depopulation program at some point? Because our populations do tend to grow geometrically, and that outpaces the amount of food replenishment that can be generated. And at a certain point, you can calculate relatively that a crisis point will be hit as we exceed our carrying capacity. And so you will have to be promoting at some point, or at least accepting of some form of scientific dictatorship to depopulate the majority of the species. Even though you seem like a nice person and you probably don't want that, your axiom has that demand in it.
Right.
You might want to either accept that and become a dictator or a fascist, or maybe revisit your axioms if you want to stay a good person and think through another way of addressing what you thought a human being was. That might have another attribute beyond our animalistic monkey-like attributes. Maybe there's something else this person might be overlooking. Same thing for Chardin, right? Like, he doesn't say it explicitly. So I've seen many people who love him who've gotten very offended with what I've written, saying he never said he never called for a scientific dictatorship. No, he didn't call for it. But look at his core axioms that he devotes his life to defending.
Yep.
Which are lies, and he knows that they're lies, but he doesn't care. They're that important to him as articles of faith. And so if he holds on to that, yeah, you're going to have a one world government fact centered around some form of high priesthood that he self-consciously says that he wants to be, and sees himself as a reformer, a new Moses, creating a new religion. He directly says that. So like, accept that, like, it's not a big deal. People need to just take it in.
Boy, has his disciples run with it. I mean, you look at like Robert Mueller, who was a direct student of Uthant, but Uthant was under Chardin. And Robert
Right.
Mueller, right? He was Secretary General of the UN for 4 decades, and created the World Core Curriculum based on Alice Bailey's work, Education in the New Age, and talked about how we have to create planetics, which I think was also quite heavily inspired by Maslow, Abraham Maslow, who wrote his Politics 3. It was published posthumously. I think it was in 1972. Actually, interestingly enough, by Willis Harman, who was also working
Hmm.
on Changing Images of Man, same time, who was also president of IONS, Institute of Noetic Sciences, for 2 decades. So just interesting kind of threads of continuity there. But yeah, and then Barbara Morse Hubbard, who devotes most of her ideas to Teilhard de Chardin. So you look at the fruits of this, and it's basically building out the singularity. And I think what we're seeing really is it is this dialectical kind of a spiral. It's just I really do envision it as like the centrifugal force is just like just shooting it towards this omega point, which is the singularity. But you have the two, which is kind of the one who are a little bit more obviously the theosophical vein, like Chardin, where they're creating this new religion with this Christianese kind of language, but ultimately it's really very theosophical in nature. And then you have the other, certainly the Dark Enlightenment is a good example, who are much more pragmatist, kind of taking after the accelerationist school of philosophy, but they're more materialistic, pragmatic, and mechanistic, and so.
Mm.
But you have the both, but neither of them to me are rooted in reality, and both of them are very Gnostic in their frame. One sees that you're going to have the religious kind of spiritualist high priest, right? Kind of spiritual eugenics, and it'll be the ascended masters who will be the ruling class, and then you have the other who are kind of just the billionaire tech bro class, and they're going to be the rulers of the scientific dictatorship.
Yeah.
But either way, you're ending up in a noosphere that's leading you towards a technological singularity.
Yeah.
Look
No,
at
I agree. Well, we had these controlled dialectics. Yeah, they're all over the place. But you had a great example of that in the French Revolution. You and I did a show on that a while back, and you know, you look at what they did when they overthrew Christianity. They're like, finally we did it. And yeah, there was tons of problems and corruption and all of these bad things inside the French Catholic Church in those days. But there was also something very viable, as far as people who actually took the time to read the writings of their Bible and like take in the principles of Jesus's message. Some really good philosophy right there that makes you a better person. Oh yeah, that's it right there. Yeah, that's the show we did. And so, they finally did it. They banned Christianity, they extracted it, and then they're like, well, we need to still satisfy the religious needs of a people. You can't organize a state without that. So then you had these different factions going to war with each other within France, between the Girondins and the Jacobin crowd and the Gironde. One group was trying to create a new synthetic religion around the cult of the supreme being. The other group was trying to create a new religious cult around the cult of reason,
Mhm.
which wasn't really reason at all. It was just like Enlightenment, Voltairean logic, and Cartesian logic to the extreme that denied the possibility of a transcendental metaphysics or a god. And the other group was like all about this deified, Rosicrucian supreme being that integrated all of the good and the evil in the universe into this imagined supreme being thing. And they just took turns killing each other. Oh yeah, it's from Wikipedia, the cult of reason. Yeah, that's the yep.
Well, I would say
So
the cult of reason is also Hegelian, right? Hegel talked about right the Geist was moving
yeah,
towards the rational absolute. So this is also very much in line with Chardin. It's this idea that the world spirit is going to evolve towards this rational absolute, which is that's going to be the radical freedom of man, which is also another argument I get from people who defend Chardin. They say, well, he's a proponent of radical freedom. I'm like, yeah, so is Barbara Marx Hubbard, but their idea of freedom is that freedom as an end. It's very like Thelema, Crowleyan, it's do with
Yeah.
that wilt or will to power. But it's very collectivist. And but the reason I brought this up is because when he talks about the rational absolute, he talks about, obviously it's in German, but he talks about speculative. And he says that speculative is what the rational is. And he said it's no different than the mystical. So he himself admits that it's not reason as in what we think, that's really Aesopian language. It's crafted, one for the initiated and one for people who think that this is rational philosophy that's grounded in reason, which we typically think of as being more empirical and realistic, provable. But he himself says it's mystical.
Yeah, no, that's very, very important. And I think, yeah, like I was rereading a little bit this morning. There was that book by Frances Yates in the 70s
Yep.
called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment.
Yep.
It's a useful book, and she's herself a Rosicrucian,
Yep.
so you got to take everything she's saying with it.
Are more revealing oftentimes. So
Yeah, and as long as you always keep in mind that they're giving you a story that they want you to have in mind when you think about the thing, and because their entire cosmology is based on lying to non-initiates, you always have to be very circumspect, but they're still very proud of this process that they're tapping into, which they believe is so ancient.
mm-hmm.
That's the Frances Yates book there.
Yeah.
And yeah, like in it, there's whole sections on the origins of the Enlightenment. Obviously, that's the book, but you have like the British Royal Society that
Mm-hmm.
grew out of it came into being just after the English Civil War was finished, and those who created it, like Christopher Wren and Francis Boyle, and I
Mm-hmm.
mean Robert, forgot his name. Anyway, you had pretty much most of the founders of it were all Rosicrucian members of what they already were a part of through the Invisible College. They were all followers of John Dee,
Mm-hmm.
of earlier of also not earlier, but also Francis Bacon. These are occult black magician figures who had played a big role in infiltrating and transforming England into an instrument for the expression or the projection of political power and dominion over the world. These are figures who were behind the creation of the British East India Company, who corrupted the intelligentsia of England, oversaw the murder of Thomas More and authentic Platonists who had been fighting to keep the Renaissance heritage alive in England, who got their heads cut off. And it wasn't just Thomas More; there were many others.
Yeah.
So these groups were the ones who took over. They helped formulate things like the Anglican Church, as what looks to me just a different variation of the Jesuit Church that was created in the same year in 1534. So these are the groups that were doing this, and they were on the one hand, they were promoting a radical imperialism, a radical materialism through British science, which back in the 18th, 19th century was much more widely understood to be in opposition to what was then known as continental science,
Yep.
which was like the science of Leibniz, the schools of Christian Huygens, the Bernoulli brothers, Fermat, Pascal Fermat. Like, so those were the authentic scientists who were the ones making discoveries of the universe and applying those discoveries to making life better and more liberated for people on the earth through statecraft. And the battles for like the American Revolution was directly the outgrowth of that movement through the figure of Benjamin Franklin, the great scientist statesman. So you had this like movement in opposition to the British imperial school, or empirical, which I'm starting to see as the same thing, promoting like radical the idea that science should only be descriptive, rooted in your five senses, um, utilizing only pattern recognition thinking, which I'm sorry, like that's a pattern recognition is a useful thing that we should do.
Yeah.
But if you limit yourself to pattern recognition thinking, you think like a computer. That's what computers do. They look for patterns and they draw conclusions
Move us
and they extrapolate.
AI.
Huh?
Yeah. It's convenient for people who want to move us towards the cyber Satan AI. Right? That's
Yeah,
what it does. Yeah.
it totally does. And people have to think about it, like how that works. But so they're doing that, but they're all in their inner core occultists
Yeah.
who don't actually use that method in their life, but they're promoting that method as sort of like a trap or a cage or a net to capture as many minds as possible into a new matrix that will prevent those minds from being human. And the more you can try to commandeer science and control science and define what science is and what good scientific practice is, the more you can ensure that no new discoveries will ever emerge. Maybe new techniques might emerge,
Mm-hmm.
right? But not new discoveries, like really big discoveries. Those can't happen anymore. So that's what they were trying to do. And it was, again, better understood back in those days that the potent traditions of the real Platonists in opposition to the Neoplatonic Gnostics
Mm-hmm.
were located throughout what was then known as the continental science, of the mainland. And there was a war going on. And so I see, like, increasingly, like you said, the effect is to get people, if they are radical empiricists at a certain point, but they want to express their will at a certain point, but you don't believe in higher principles. Well, all you can do is Nietzschean will to power. You can try to impose your will onto society, and politically that can manifest in very rigid forms of tyrannical social organization. And that's one path, like you said, that's going to naturally homogenize society as it expands and projects power, destroys the weak for the benefit of the few that have power. Um, and that's one path, but and it always is in conjunction with an occult network
Mm-hmm.
that's using a different way of thinking but getting the same effect. Um, so it's a very disgusting left hand, right hand path thing that converges. And Pierre Teilhard de Chaldée is all about convergence, right? Like that's in all of his writing, how we're going to get all these different opposite attributes of humanity to converge
Converge.
at this imaginary future point. Bailey has her own thing on it too, in
For trans
for Luciferian awakening thing.
Yes. Well, with the Enlightenment, I think it's very interesting because, and I see this theme recurring constantly, but it's when you have the like uber empirical kind of materialistic school of thought juxtaposed with the completely mystical, all faith based, then it doesn't leave room for. I would argue the Scottish common sense realists were great at creating the a framework for a hybrid. But the reality is that you're always going to fall short in one or the other, because if you're, regardless of what faith based, even if it's rooted in some sort of like a biblical framework, if it's all coming from just blind faith, that takes you out of. I mean, I would say Christianity and even Judaism, the traditional Abrahamic faiths don't take you out of reality. But if it's all in the mystical realm, then you're not dealing with the here and now, and you're not dealing with the tangible. And the reality is that humans are able to know things, right? We do have five senses. We can prove things. There are things we can know, but we are also inherently limited, and every human being knows that, right? People know that there are things that we just don't know, that we can't know.
Yeah.
So obviously the empirical materialistic framework is going to fall short, because there are things that we can't know that do require faith even for us to just function. And so I think that what happens is the oligarchical social engineers start pitting those two against each other intentionally, because both systems are completely flawed. And when you get to the end, high enough through them, you realize that. And obviously I'm not talking
Yeah.
like the black magicians, or the scientists who are myopically seeped within their field. But I think for social engineering purposes, it's very convenient to pit those two against each other because they're limited and they're false.
Yeah. Yeah, they're both at their core ignorant, and they think they have knowledge of that which they don't know. And like on the one hand, those who try to define science as being a field that demands absolute mathematical certainty are going to become jaded pretty quickly and mentally dysfunctional as they interact with reality as it is, because reality, although our this is the one of the fun ambiguities of life, right, is that we develop geometries, circles and squares and pentagons and hexagons, and they're very useful geometrically, and we find them in nature, right? We find these things in the formation of flowers, in honeycombs, and in pomegranates. You know, you got the hexagonal structure, the rhombic dodecahedral structures embedded within honeycombs.
Yes.
And then you see video on Saturn, like the top of Saturn, for processes we don't fully understand yet, is organized by a hexagonal structure, which is cool. It's amazing. You see it in crystal formation too. It shows us that there's a certain geometry to the electromagnetic currents and the geometry of the atomic structure of the atoms composing various crystals. Oh yeah, Cassini, Saturn, perplexing hexagon. Yeah, that's fun. So we say like evidence of geometry, of spheres, of circles, and all over nature, of ellipses, but they're not perfect. It's like even the spheres of of the planets are not perfect. They're geodesic. They're kind of squished according to gravitational forces. So they're going to be a little bit more squished in the middle than they are, you know. Oh yeah, there's a picture of that hexagon. It's fun. Yeah, it's gorgeous.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So there's all this evidence that embedded within creation is geometry, is reason, is coherence, is harmony, you know, and you see it everywhere. But then when you can't find a perfect circle in nature, or a perfect straight line or square in nature, so perfect that a more perfect one could not be constructed. There's always slight disfigurements in these things. And so, you know, again, the radical positivist type, the radical empiricist who rejects metaphysics, will just ignore all of that, the evidence that posits a higher transcendental reality shaping that is unknowable by our pure math.
Yeah.
But that we could come to get a better grasp of if we allow sort of, you know, a more poetic, metaphorical mode of thinking, even in the realm of science. That's very, very important. We can look to the ironies, the paradoxes that you can't ever see a paradox. You can never see an irony with your eyes. You can't smell it or taste it, but you could see it with your mind's eye. If you're, again, Plato helps us build our muscles to see paradoxes more and more perfectly. And that's the gold. Like, that's better than gold. Like, those paradoxes are the place where you can prove that a core assumption that you are taking with you into your attempt to explain the unknown is flawed. And then, because you're pressing it against reality, and it's generating these discrepancies. So then that paradox becomes the leap our minds can make into a new hypothesis that replaces that false axiom by something more perfect that can resolve the dissonance, the paradox. And so that's what I've noticed when I read the writings of all of the healthy minds who make discoveries. They're all doing that. They're having a dialogue with the universe, with themselves. They're having a constant dialectic process that's a very healthy one of self-examination of their feelings, their motives, their core axioms. And the broken radical absolutist mathematician type can't do that. And the mystic, the radical mystic, which is usually the consequence of a slightly more honest radical empiricist who can't ignore the evidence of the golden section of these higher ordering processes, they're like, okay, well, they exist, but because they're intrinsically unknowable, like that's what Kant says. You know, Kant was the guy who inspired like largely the entire transcendentalist movement.
Yep.
He was like, okay, these discontinuities exist, but the only way we could know them is through some Gnostic leap of revelation that is tied to some mystery cult experience
Yep.
of a feeling. And the actual act of discovery is made in intrinsically unknowable in a Kantian
Hmm.
in his critiques of pure reason and his critiques of judgment. He's declaring war on the intelligibility of that process of eureka, and it becomes purely a mystical experience, which is why his followers, even though he promoted an empiricist mode of thinking in his school, his followers generated, like what Ralph Waldo Emerson was a follower of Kant and generated his entire transcendentalist movement from the principles of Kant, which is totally, it makes lawful sense.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make sense if people don't realize all the stuff that you and I are talking about of these two different, seemingly opposing, but actually the same path.
Yes. Well, then you end up in either the utopian camp or the nihilistic camp. Uh,
Yeah.
the followers of Kant, right? Because the transcendentalists, I would argue, were very much in the utopian kind of, or I would even say like a lot of the modern libertarians were disciples of Immanuel Kant, and they either end up in utopia, which is nowhere, but utopian kind of projection that they think is going to be glorious, or they end up in nihilism. Yeah, that seems to be kind of where
It,
this was.
that 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 essay that you wrote, by the way, The Transcendentalist Roots of the Fabian Society,
Yeah,
that you just had up on the screen.
that one, yeah.
Yeah, pop up that article again.
Yeah, this one. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. The Transcendentalist Roots of the Fabian Society. I love what you did with that. That's good. Yeah.
Thank you.
And that's
Yeah. Well,
totally,
they were like a new age group, and then this
they were a
was
new age group,
that
right? Yeah.
switched off into the Fabians. So,
Yeah, and people like Annie Besant, who was also a theosophist,
yep.
and yeah,